Well, thank you all so much for coming tonight. My name is Anderson Cook. I am the statewide programs coordinator at the South Carolina State Library and also for ReadSC, which is South Carolina's Center for the Book. My pronouns are she and her, and I want to thank you again for joining us tonight. We have an author talk featuring Susan Beckham Zurenda. This is in partnership with the Georgia Center for the Book. This is the On My Mind series where we work with authors that are either from South Carolina or Georgia, writing usually about the South. So I want to thank the Georgia Center for the Book for their partnership on this, and thank you all for being here. So just so you know, tonight's talk is going to be formatted with the actual talk that Susan will be doing, and then after her talk, I'm going to open the floor for questions. If you have a question that you would like to ask, please put it in the chat box, which should be at the bottom of your screen in a little gray. So if you have a question, please let us know. And we will definitely ask that at the end of the session. So before we jump in, I want to say a few words about our author, Susan Beckham Zurenda. So she taught literature and composition and creative writing to high school students and college students for 33 years, and then finally was able to work on her own novel, and that is this novel, Bells for Eli, her debut, which was selected as a Winter 2020 Okra Pick by the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. It has been nominated for a Pushcart Prize in 2021. So we're really thrilled to have her tonight. And she worked on her undergraduate and master's degree in English and now is working as a book publicist for Magic Time Literary Publicity. She has been loving writing and reading since early childhood, and the story she told me is that this started with her father reading poetry to her at bedtime, which is just such a lovely image. And with that, I want to hand it over to Susan. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Great, now I'm here. I am so happy to be here, and I thank you, Anderson, so much for hosting me, and thank the South Carolina Center for the Book and the coordination with the Georgia Center for the Book. It's just a pleasure to be here and talk about a particular topic in Bells for Eli, and that is the consequences of childhood trauma. There are a lot of different things that I can talk about in the novel, and I loved the 60s music that Anderson was playing before we started. There is a great deal of music in the novel, but tonight I'm going to center on the consequences of childhood trauma because my character Eli is a victim of that. So trauma is a complex word. We, I think, associate the term most often with military personnel who are exposed to war trauma and who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, and individuals who suffer with what we call PTSD. They suffer symptoms like flashbacks, nightmares, emotional withdrawal, anger, fear. My own paternal grandfather, whom I never met, he had PTSD from his service in World War I. The condition then was called shell shock, of course. And my grandmother couldn't manage the magnitude of the war's effects on her husband and raised two daughters. And so, as the story was told to me, my grandfather was sent to live with two sisters until he died at around age 60. He misused alcohol. He often physically shook with fear. Sometimes he hallucinated when re-experiencing his traumatic events. But exposure to traumatic experiences does not affect just those exposed to war. The consequences of repeated trauma are and have always been part of the human condition, even for children. In my novel, Bells for Eli, my character Ellison Winfield, who is called Eli, experiences long-lasting physical and emotional trauma that begins with a devastating accident at age 3 when he swallows, Red Devil Lye from a Coca-Cola bottle. His father had been using the substance because it has properties like helium. We think of it as a chemical that cleans drains, and it did. I think it's not used at all today, but it also had properties like helium, and so he was using it to blow up balloons for his son's birthday party. And I want to read a passage from the book, And this takes place after Eli has returned home after his accident from his 6-month stay at Boston Children's Hospital in November of 1959. A different time, different kind of medical procedures than we would have today for a similar accident. His beloved cousin, Adeline Green, who's called Delia, she is the protagonist of the novel, and she is the first person narrator of the novel. And she explains her cousin's circumstances here as best she can understand them from a 4-year-old's perspective when she first sees Eli after he comes home. Delia is 21 years old when she narrates the story of her and Eli's lives, but she often speaks from the viewpoint of a younger self, as of course she does here. When I first saw Eli after the accident, the string both fascinated and puzzled me. It looked like ordinary white cotton twine, often slipping from its place tucked behind his ear and falling across his lower cheek. I asked questions until my mother relented and tried to explain. The doctors in the hospital tugged on the string in Eli's nose to pull the tube through his gastric tract to his throat, she said. Then they reversed the course by pulling on the other end of the string stationed at the hole in his stomach. Why? I asked my mother. The poison caused scar tissue and other things I don't know. The doctors have to keep everything open, she said. Does it hurt? I asked. They give him medicine so it doesn't hurt as much, she said. Her explanation made little sense to me. I didn't know what scar tissue meant. I was too young to envision it, and I had never seen, nor would I ever see, the bottom end of the string. I could, however, imagine the pain of an object in Eli's throat, since I had once tried to swallow an aspirin. The hard, solid pill made me gag. It terrified me, and I refused to try again. So whenever I needed it, Mama mashed up aspirin with the back of a teaspoon in Coca-Cola, and I drank it from a cup. I learned much later the doctors in Boston recommended my aunt and uncle put Eli in an institutional setting and predicted he would never be able to live at home. Mary Lily and Jean refused to believe them. When they brought him home, Aunt Mary Lily learned how to feed Eli. She ground his food in the blender, removed his stomach plug herself, and inserted the pureed mush into his stomach with a turkey baster. After each meal, she'd take the plug back in place. Eli's parents could not, however, maneuver the dilator on their own. So routinely, Eli returned to Boston Children's Hospital. The trips were costly and disruptive, and Eli hated each one. Finally, toward the end of 2nd grade, when his esophagus was bigger, an alternative was proposed. Eli could swallow a flexible tube weekly instead of having the procedure in Boston. He was promised the permanent removal of the string as incentive to learn how to swallow the dilator and pull it back out himself. Well, Eli's calamity generates trauma on top of more trauma until it seems more than a young child can bear. But he survives. He is a fighter. And by age 12, it appears he has conquered his ordeal. He looks normal on the outside. He has friends. And with his tracheotomy gone, he can even swim like other kids do. Only, really, he isn't thriving. He is still very much in survival mode. In truth, I didn't know that I had created a classic illustration of lasting childhood trauma in the character of Eli until my cousin Jeannie, who is the director of behavioral psychology at Duke University, told me I had done so after she read the novel. I started out and wanted to develop how a severe accident at a young age with physical and emotional consequences lasting throughout much of childhood could set the trajectory of a life. And when I developed Eli's adolescent character of a boy who looks normal on the outside, but is still suffering on the inside, I was mostly working from intuition. My novel, though, is inspired by a similar traumatic incident that one of my first cousins experienced at a young age. My paternal uncle, my father's brother, poured Red Devil Lye into a Coca-Cola bottle to blow up balloons for my cousin Danny's second birthday party. I was told my uncle left the bottle on the back steps and Danny drank from it. They were living in Plainfield, New Jersey, and my family lived in South Carolina. So I didn't grow up in the same state with my real life cousin, nor would I have been old enough to remember the accident. But I saw Danny at various times in our growing up years. And I recall one occasion when his family was at our house visiting, a neighborhood friend of mine happened to come over to my house, and there were 5 of us children playing in the backyard, and my nosy friend would not stop asking Danny questions about his appearance. Why did he breathe through his throat? Why did he have a string in his nose? Why was there mucus coming out of the holes in the metal plate in his throat? And Danny tried to ignore her, but she didn't let up. He finally climbed to the top of the sliding board and sat there. And I remember feeling for him. Later, when we were adolescents or close to adolescence, his family moved to Charlotte, North Carolina. And so he was only about an hour's drive from me. And we became close friends when we were teenagers. I was a child in the early 60s, so I don't actually know. But I don't think during this era, when Danny's accident happened, that people believed childhood trauma could have permanent consequences. We aren't living in the 60s anymore, and we've come a long way in understanding. But I still hear adults say things like, he was so young when that happened, he won't remember when he's an adult, or those experiences will make her tough when she's older. What doesn't kill us makes us stronger. However, these adages can be very wrong where many children are concerned. It may be that trauma exposure to a young child is especially injurious because children and their brains and nervous systems are still developing, and being traumatized can negatively affect brain development. In response to childhood trauma, or trauma at any age for that matter, the body courses with adrenaline and cortisol to help the victim fight or run away. But a child can't often escape his or her traumatic circumstances. And living this way for a long time can have a big impact on the body and on the psyche. Even if later in life the child finds him or herself in a functional, supportive environment without pain, the stress response that was so adaptive in the child's traumatic or abusive environment might be maladaptive for a flexible, connected, and fulfilling life. As a result, children who suffer trauma might grow up responding quickly and decisively to the smallest signs of threat. And as a defense mechanism, they might also suppress their emotions. Such children don't want to be quiet and still because if they are, their memories surface. And with their high cortisol levels, these children often yearn for excitement that distracts them so that they don't have to feel anything. And in my book, Eli is unwilling to self-reflect and examine his feelings. He craves excitement and risk because dangerous activities like climbing towers allow him to escape his feelings. Drugs also enable him to escape, and as he refers to it, bring peace. But he also develops into a young person with a tremendous compassion and caring for others in need because he understands suffering and persecution. Now, obviously, not every child experiencing repeated trauma will develop, thankfully, PTSD symptoms. A 2012 IDSO, Gyragov, and IDSO study found that for students who experienced bullying, 27.6% of boys and 40.5% of girls had PTSD scores in the clinical range. And anywhere from 12% to 52% of people who had a long-term chronic illness as children will have PTSD or other lingering emotional side effects from what they endured. My character Eli experiences both situations, a long-term painful medical condition and relentless bullying by his peers. And though no one in the novel seems to focus on a connection between Eli's adolescent behavior and his childhood experiences, least of all him, he is indeed among those trauma survivors who remain permanently scarred. Now, in spite of his limitations and pain, Eli is an amazing boy. He never quits. Other boys mock him for being a weakling, but what Eli lacks in physical strength, he makes up for in spirit. On his first day of school, and it's second grade because he wasn't strong enough yet to go to public school in first grade and had a tutor, a boy named Willard Timms is the first to react to Eli's abnormal appearance. Sitting behind him while their teacher, Mrs. Hamill, distributes textbooks, Willard asks Eli about the string running from his nose, behind his ear, and secured at the back of his neck. Eli ignores the question. Willard then tugs on the string, causing Eli to gasp and rise up out of his seat. Well, Mrs. Hamill quickly realizes the ruckus and harshly scolds Willard, who dutifully does begin to unpack his school supplies and seemingly forget about Eli. But bullies can be persistent. And not long after, at recess one day, Delia describes Willard's retaliation. And I'm going to read another passage to you. On the playground, I asked Eli what he wanted to do, if maybe he wanted to walk with Neely, Gloria, and me. Let's swing, he said. We walked over to the long line of canvas-strapped seats. Most of them were empty, so we had our pick. I could see Gloria and Neely in the distance, walking the perimeter of the playground, but I couldn't join them. I had to stay with Eli. Our legs pumped hard. We were in an unspoken competition to see who could reach the highest point when three boys stepped in front of us. One of them was Willard Timms. What's sissy boy doing? Swinging with his girl cousin? Willard said. He reached out and caught the chains on Eli's upswing and brought him to an abrupt stop. They faced each other, Eli sitting, his breathing labored from his exertion on the swing, and Willard towering above him. The other boys, Jimmy Watson and Joe Cribb, stood nearby. You're nasty, Willard said. You know that? You're the one who's nasty, Eli responded. I stopped my swing quickly by lowering my feet and dragging them in the dirt. Every muscle in my body grew tense. Let's see who's nasty, Willard said. He looked over at Jimmy and Joe. Eli stood up from the swing, facing Willard. I wanted to run for Mrs. Hamill, but there wasn't time. Willard swung at Eli's face. Immediately, a thin stream of blood appeared, trickling from Eli's nose. But Eli did not fall, and he did not so much as whimper. He stood erect, his nose bleeding down his lips, and kicked as hard as he could into Willard's groin. My heart squeezed with pride when Willard screamed in feral pain. I imagined a phrase Eli sometimes repeated going through his head. All's fair in love and war. Jimmy and Joe stepped up, ready to pounce on Eli, but by then, everyone on the playground had tuned in, including the teachers. Mrs. Couser arrived first and separated the boys. She grabbed Willard's ear, twisting it until he was forced to lean into her. With her other hand, she yanked Eli's arm and dragged both of them to Miss Crockett's office. Now, as I mentioned, by early adolescence, all the outward appearances of Eli's accident have disappeared. He wears no string. The tracheotomy is gone. He breathes through his nose. He exhibits no foul smell because the opening in his stomach has been closed. And after a series of trials, he proves himself to the other boys, and he's no longer bullied. He possesses a natural brilliance, and he's gifted with charm and charisma. He's a talented musician, inspired by the sound of bells. Nothing lures Eli more than a bell tower, especially the old fire tower with its large alarm bell behind his aristocratic grandmother's antebellum home. Eli is an adolescent full of potential. He is empathetic, he has a keen awareness of others' pain, and it is stimulating to be his friend because risk does not scare him. But Eli embodies many PTS symptoms that do impair him. He angers quickly, he blocks his feelings, he exhibits self-destructive behavior, and, except for Delia, often has difficulty trusting others. And as has been the case since childhood, he is adept at hiding his internal physical and emotional pain. As he ages, and the book, of course, begins when he's 3 with his accident, and it ends in their college years. As he ages, Eli's persistent need for stimulation to distract him from dealing with his emotions becomes more and more problematic. He listens to no one. He uses illegal drugs to excess. His need to forget surpasses everything. And after his beloved grandmother, whom he calls Mimi, dies, against the advice of Delia and his girlfriend Isabel, Eli climbs the fire tower behind her house to toll the years of his grandmother's life. The 60-foot metal tower is old and unstable. It's metal, but it's unstable. But Eli relishes the risk, for it distracts him from his sadness. He loved his grandmother very much. So I'll read you one more passage, and this is during the teenage years. Still, of course, Delia narrating. Isabel and I stood on the lawn beside Mimi's hen house, waiting. I inhaled deeply, watching Eli approach the tower. The air seemed redolent with straw and foul, but that was impossible, for there had been no chickens for several years. Still wearing his dress slacks and white shirt, though he'd changed into tennis shoes, my cousin climbed. Isabel reached out and gripped my forearm. She looked away nervously toward the south end of the pasture. I observed Eli intently. I watched him pass through the small opening onto the narrow spaced slats of the platform around the bell. I watched him right himself at the top, walk the perimeter. I waved, but he did not see me, or if he did not respond. He began to swing the bell. The rings, hard and powerful, vibrated into the ground around us. 8 tolls, a pause, and 4 more. Mimi's life, I understood, 84 years. The echoing sound moved through me like the bell had rung out from heaven. I looked toward Isabel. He's okay, see? I said. You can look. Hesitantly, she eyed the tower. Eli stood beside the bell. Isabel motioned him down in big, sweeping waves of her arm. He understood and mimicked the action. Damn him, ever the performer. I threw my own hand in the air and pointed my index finger down in a strong, jerking gesture. I couldn't hear him, of course, but if I could, I suspected he might be laughing at our agitation. All of a sudden, he collapsed onto the graded platform surrounding the bell. What is he doing? Isabel shrieked. Not sure, I said. Eli had never sat on the slats before, at least not when I was around. It made me nervous. I squinted upward, my eyes watering against the intensity of the sun. I could see him sitting cross-legged and looking at something in his hands. It dawned on me quickly. He was reading whatever was on that paper he had stuffed in his pocket. reading it while he was alone. And I should say they've been inside his grandmother's house before this and rummaging through things. Jesus, what is he doing sitting down? Isabel asked again. Is he trying to torture us? No way could I see eye to eye with my cousin from that distance, but it was as though I could. Still as stone, I stared up at him. Isabel began flailing her arms, and I grabbed her to keep her still. I continued to stare, hoping if Isabel and I did not react, he would come down. I could no longer see the paper and assumed it was back in his pocket. He continued to sit. Minutes passed. His inertia scared me. Finally, he stood and rotated his arms in a windmill toward us. The bizarre standoff ended. I determined to know what he'd been reading as soon as he reached the ground. He planted his feet on the slats, withdrew to the opening, passed through, and began to descend. Isabel and I strolled toward the bottom of the ladder, our chatter marking our relief, when I heard a grinding pop and then a clank of metal. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct. I looked up to see my cousin dangling on rungs come loose from their connection to the tower, maybe 20 feet above us. He'd not swung far, but clearly the ladder was no longer anchored below him. Eli had come unmoored. I opened my mouth involuntarily to scream, but what came out was a dry, hollow gag. Isabel screamed with as much might as I've ever heard in a human being before or since. Stop, I croaked at her. Please stop. But she continued. You've got to stop. You're making it worse, I said, but she couldn't help it. Her instincts had taken over. I don't think she heard me. I ran from her, spanning the few remaining yards to the ladder. Don't touch it, Eli yelled down, his voice trembling, and I knew he too feared the loose section would break off. I shielded my eyes with my hand and looked up again into the sun's glare. The white soles of his tennis shoes quivered on the swaying ladder. Listen to me, Eli. You've got to get off the ladder now. I can see from here what you have to do. Before it falls all the way, I thought. My throat clawed tight. I coughed hard and spoke again. Put your left foot on the cross support beside you, and then your right. Hold on above and inch both feet into the corner at the steel column. I'm going to jump, he called. It's too far, I warned. My voice suddenly returned. Isabel arrived beside me, no longer screaming, but breathing hard in spasms. I've got to jump. I can't stay up here, he said, leaning out, making the ladder shudder. Herculean as he was in aspect, he believed he could leap safely to the ground. I knew he'd kill himself. I'll leave it there and conclude by saying, while Eli cherishes Delia more than anyone and attempts to protect her from her own troubles, he cares not for protecting himself. His indelible internal wounds harbor pain and insecurity, scars that rule his impulses. From early in their lives, Delia guards Eli, and it's a responsibility that grows more challenging every year. Eli's life, I think, illustrates the complexity of fate, how it takes with one hand and gives with the other. Yes, Eli is a tormented young man, yet he is also a young man with a tremendous capacity for love and compassion. His accident changes the typical relationship he and Delia might have had into one of incomparable love and deep complexity, developing into a love forbidden by social constraints. Theirs is a world where cruelty and pain threaten two cousins, whose extraordinary love prevails, a world in which, in the end, Delia will learn a deep family secret and truths about Eli she has never known. So I would be happy. I'm not an expert on childhood trauma, though I've done a lot of research and talked a lot to my as I mentioned to you, is the director of behavioral psychology at Duke. So I'd be glad to try to answer those kinds of questions, or any that you might have about the novel or the process or whatever.
Thank you, Susan. So for everyone who does not know, I am going to press enter, and I have shared with you some links both to Susan's webpage, the Georgia Center for the Book page, and ReadSC's page, which is the South Carolina Center for the Book, so that you know where to put your questions if you have any. And I definitely have a few, and I took some notes while you were talking. So this was one of the last things that you sort of touched on, and I understand that you took part of the inspiration for your novel from one of your own cousin's traumatic experiences. But what was it that made you want to write about a relationship that is taboo as part of this novel about trauma?
That question has been asked to me before. Early on, a magazine interviewer asked me that question, and it kind of stunned me, because the truth is, I really didn't decide to write about a taboo relationship. As crazy as that sounds, I decided to write a story about first cousins who lived across the street from each other and grew extraordinarily close, in large part because of Eli's accident. But when they become sexual beings, adolescents, these feelings are there, the depth of their feelings for each other, the trust that they have is there. And one night I was sitting at the computer writing, and it was a scene. I was writing the scene after Eli and Delia had left a dance, a cotillion in Columbia. It's the only real town named in the book. And Delia has, Eli has taken Delia to the dance, and asked a lot of boys to dance with her to try to get her over, so to speak, a destructive relationship with her boyfriend. He's worried about actually Delia being used, and he intends to divulge an indiscretion on his part with a girl, in hopes that it will affect Delia. But they park the car, and Delia says, "Why are we going parking?" He says, "Oh, I don't know. We'll just, you know." But he, his whole purpose is to tell her about this indiscretion. But he's pretty wasted, number one. And he puts, you played Stairway to Heaven. He puts Stairway to Heaven on the 8-track tape. And I just, the cousins their feelings became intimate. They reached out to each other, and I was more or less the observer watching it happen. I didn't plan it. It was just inevitable. The relationship they'd had, it became inevitable for it to happen to them. And so it became inevitable for me as the author to write it for them. I know that sounds kind of crazy mystical, but that's exactly the way it happened. I did not plan it, but I realized writing that night that it was inevitable.
I know many authors talk about how their characters lead them down paths that they did not anticipate. So that makes plenty of sense.
Yes, yes. And it was the right, I mean, it was the right thing. It was the inevitable thing. It would have been false to their relationship and to the character, to who they are, if I hadn't let them go there, if that makes sense.
Right. So you brought up Eli's risky behavior again just now, including abusing drugs. And this is kind of a deviated question, but had Eli not experienced that trauma when he was younger, what kinds of things do you think he might have done instead that would have brought him peace?
Eli is a musician. And, I mean, of course, I created the character, and I can't say, I mean, possibly he would have followed, the counterculture was encroaching. I mean, the small town South was still a very insular time, even in the late 60s, but the counterculture was encroaching, and lots of young people embraced it. But Eli is a musician. His mother is a pianist who was schooled at Juilliard, and he has talent and he plays the piano beautifully, but what he loves is percussion. And I would like to think that he could have found himself more, he does embrace the music, but kind of found himself, and like you said, find peace in a healthier outlet like that.
Right. So, on the subject of music, why was that such an important aspect of the novel to include, both as you mentioned with Eli and with his mother and everything going on around them?
Well, I wanted to give him a passion, in spite of his limitations and all when he was a child. I wanted to give him a passion, something that he was really, really good at. And he's smart anyway. He's a very smart boy and adolescent, but I want to do that. Plus, truth be told, I started out life as a music major. So I know a little something about music, and so I could write about a character who is a musician.
That makes a lot of sense. I know a lot of people are very passionate about music, especially if they have.
Yes, I started out as a music major, and when I took a course in Southern literature, the beginning of my sophomore year, my life changed. I never wanted to be a musical performer. I think that was my mother's great dream, and I was just so taken with the stories of those women, Southern women writers of the mid 20th century. I changed my path.
Understandable. So, going back to childhood trauma, I know that you mentioned that you did a lot of research. What were some of the things that surprised you specifically about trauma and the impacts of trauma that you found while you were researching the novel?
Well, as I said, I pretty much intuitively wrote the story. I really didn't know I was writing a classic illustration of trauma. So it was after the fact, when I was in revisions and things, that I did, more research. Now, okay, I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought. Anderson, asked me what you were going to ask me again.
You're fine. So it's what surprised you about trauma and the lasting impacts of trauma that you found when you were doing that research?
I think the thing that surprises me most, and that I was happening in my character, and that after, in revisions, I really focused on, is how a child who has undergone repeated trauma, either physical, emotional, or both, as in the case of Eli, will do almost anything to to block the memories, to keep from going back there. And it causes, it causes all kinds of other problems, like escape through risky behavior, or not trusting people, but just the absolute determination not to talk about what happened, and not to go back there in your head. And I've been asked, why didn't I tell the story through Eli's point of view? Well, that's one of the reasons, that Eli doesn't go back there. He doesn't dwell, or tries not to ever think about the bullying he endured, the medical procedures he endured. So it made sense to me to tell it through Delia's observation of him.
Right. So before today, you and I talked about different kinds of trauma, and specifically, you and I talked about how this pandemic is potentially a traumatic experience. So I know that that's different from Eli's experience, but can you talk about what about this pandemic you consider to be traumatic or is generally agreed to be traumatic?
Well, I'm no psychologist, but for me personally, the pandemic, I'm better now, but it has made it really hard for me to focus. And I've heard other people say that too, that they can't do, other writers have said to me, they have a hard time writing. Even readers, have a hard time reading books. I've had a hard time reading. I am back to writing now, but for the first couple of months or so, it was just very hard to focus. And I think other people have experienced that too. But I know we're all on edge. We're just all on edge from this because we're social creatures. Human beings are meant to be together. And as wonderful as it is to be in a situation like this where people can tune in from Georgia or wherever, that's wonderful. But we still need to be with each other in person, I think.
Right. No, I completely agree. It's good to acknowledge some of the benefits that we've had, but to ignore the more damaging or difficult aspects wouldn't be accurate.
Right.
It has been a challenge for a lot of people.
It has. It has.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you're writing. Do you have another novel in the works?
I'm trying. I am working on a second novel. It's not a period piece. It's not. It's set more in modern day. Although I'm setting it in 2012 because I wanted it to take place before technology completely took over in the classroom. I know a whole lot about teaching, and I'm setting the novel in a high school. I'm trying to tell it from 3 points of view. Whether I'll be successful or not remains to be seen. But the 3 points of view are a high school English teacher, not me, because this teacher is a lot funkier and probably a lot nicer than I was. She's very empathetic, really kind of gets into the lives of some of her students. And the other two voices are a very privileged, very smart, going to Ivy League school, Caucasian senior boy, and an impoverished, very capable, but impoverished, never had any advantages, biracial girl who lives in a motel. And the boy and the girl are going to meet in school suspension, a place that boy never thought he'd find himself.
Well, that sounds like a very interesting novel. I'm looking forward to reading that whenever you are able to get it published and finished. I know that, as you mentioned, it's difficult to write in the pandemic, but we're looking forward to that.
Yeah, I'm doing a lot better now.
That's good to hear. Well, unless we have any more questions, I think we're going to wrap it up for tonight. Again, if you do not already have a copy of Bells for Eli, please pick one up from your local bookseller. I know that, Susan, you have it listed on your website you have options to order from your website.
I do.
So as I mentioned, that is in the chat. If you want to check in on Susan's progress with her book or with other publishings and events that she's got going on, please visit her website. I also have the Georgia Center for the Book. Thank you again to our compatriots in Georgia for joining.
Yes, thank you so much.
We are really—
Hi, Joe.
Hey, Joe. We're really looking forward to this ongoing partnership, the On My Mind series, which is an ongoing partnership between authors throughout the Southeast, featuring Georgia.
Oh, thank you.
Got a copy of the book right there. So again, if you do not have a copy, please check one out from your local bookseller. And if you want to attend events like this for the future, check out the Georgia Center for the Book. Again, that's linked, or readsc.org, which is also linked. And
yeah, it's going to be a great collaboration.
I'm really looking forward to it. It's already been great.
And I'm published by Georgia Press,
Perfect. As I said, driving home those parts.
Mercer.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. And if you would like to watch this recording again, maybe see a different aspect, we will have this recording available on YouTube. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Anderson. Thank you, Joe. Thanks, everybody.
Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.